When David Parkin began his playing career at Hawthorn, he did so after winning the Hawks' best and fairest in 1965. Later, he took the side to a premiership, and after 21 years and 518
the oldest
games
of the AFL coaching fraternity, at 57, with nearly 500 games to his illustrious name, David Parkin is a mercurial mixture of academic, reformer and old-fashioned ranter and raver.
The privilege of captaining Hawthorn to their second premiership in a game against St Kilda where we came from behind in the last quarter to win a very tight finish in front of 120,000 people here. That was probably the highlight of my football career. Having lived a parallel life as long as I can remember in education and in sport, when I was given the opportunity at Deakin in the early 1990s to establish the first sports coaching and administration course, was probably, in looking back now, one of the more enjoyable and satisfying experiences. Sports of all types have been central to influencing attitudes towards racial discrimination, violence against women, illicit and performance-enhancing drugs, homophobia, work-life balance and equal opportunity, to highlight a few.
Football gave my brothers and I a sense of community, and it gave me a sense of belonging.
You can make a difference, every one of you. You can be different.
Sport is a wonderful antidote to so many of the things that cause us stress.
If I didn't say anything, I would be letting down a lot of people who have been bullied over the years.
Cooperation is critical. It is the thing that holds your team or group together. It's the thing that holds our society together.
It's not a privilege to play sport, it's a right if that's what a woman chooses to do. Any sport, it's her choice.
Cycling is a fantastic solution to a lot of problems that we have in society right now. Transport, infrastructure, childhood obesity and long-term health, heart disease and so on.
Battling against being in a male-dominated industry, you always felt you had to be strong, try to look stronger and match it with the men, and had to be as vigorous as them to be seen to be as strong. The movie name Ride Like a Girl was Ride Like a Girl and be proud of it.
I distinctly remember being in the lounge room, we were all sitting around watching the footy and it was only men on TV. And at that particular moment, I walked out because I thought, no, this is just ridiculous that I have the skill set to be able to play at a high level, but the sport that I loved growing up, I could no longer have that opportunity.
Yeah, one of the hardest things I think is where you started is being prepared to lose every day publicly, days, weeks on end, to win at the end. And that's one of the tougher ones in public leadership, because no one else has to do that. But if you're not prepared to lose for a long time to win, you'll never do anything big or great. You'll just be, transactional.
Sports in Australia, which captivates the hearts and minds of both sexes, across all ages and within all social economic groups, has a massive and very powerful role to play in changing attitudes to hosts of very important issues.
Good evening. It's lovely to see so many here in this lovely setting on this beautiful evening. Welcome to the 2024 Deakin University David Parkin Oration for Sport and Social Change. I begin by acknowledging the Aboriginal custodians of the lands on which we are assembled here tonight. We pay our respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. It is my pleasure to welcome Deakin University Chancellor Mr John Stanhope AO, Deputy Chancellors Miss Carol Boyer-Spooner and Miss Lynn Roberts AO. I also acknowledge Deakin's Vice-Chancellor Professor Ian Martin, who will open the event in just a few moments. To council members, members of executives and distinguished guests, I did note that Kevin Sheedy was on our invite list today, so I'm not sure if he made it, but for those who were there, you just saw Kevin deliver the 2014 Parkin Oration, which sits on the Oration portal. To colleagues and friends of Deakin, I begin by acknowledging our Oration patron, Dr David Parkin, OAM. Tonight we celebrate the 11th Parkin Oration in recognition of David's outstanding legacy across the sporting landscape. A time-honoured legend of the AFL, David's career has been defined by his enduring commitment to the role that education plays as a foundation of empowerment and growth. It is that which draws us here tonight. Once again, thank you, David, for graciously allowing us to leverage your formidable profile and legacy to drive this event. It provides us with a unique opportunity to delve into the world of sporting stars and administrators whose thoughts and actions have had significant impact beyond the playing fields. In that context, it gives me immense pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished guests of honour tonight, Peggy O'Neill, AO, the immediate past president of the Richmond Football Club, and CEO Brendan Gale. We eagerly anticipate your insights as you reflect on the decade that you shared leading the club and the expectations of its passionate, if not a little impatient, army of supporters. It is my great pleasure to welcome to the Parkin Oration tonight's moderator, the very highly respected Tim Lane. Welcome, Tim. We are truly privileged to have your support here tonight. The Deakin social media team invite you to tweet messages throughout the evening using the official hashtag @ParkinOration. I was going to say as shown on the screen behind me, but I don't think it is. We ask you that you refrain from any video or audio recordings of tonight's oration. To commence formal proceedings this evening, I welcome to the stage Deakin University Vice-Chancellor, Professor Ian Martin.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. And can I extend my welcome here to everybody tonight on behalf of Deakin University. It is fantastic to see people here tonight. These are a very special part of the Deakin University annual calendar, and David, we are in your debt for what you have given us. I won't repeat Chris's list of acknowledgements. We've got some wonderful people here tonight, but I do want to particularly thank Peggy and Brendan for giving their time tonight to share what I'm sure will be a fantastic conversation, and Tim for moderating it. As Chris has said, this is our 11th oration. It would have been the 12th, but something got in the way of one of them. But it was established to show the potential and the power of sport, not just to make a difference on the field, but to make a difference beyond the field, something that you've heard David in the video speak so passionately about. Sport gives us unique opportunities to contribute, to make a difference, to share, to be tribal and friendly all at the same time. It does so much. And for Deakin, excellence in sports education and research has established Deakin as one of the premier institutions in the world. And that small course that David mentioned in the video that he started a number of years ago now is amongst the best sports administration courses in the world, and that's not just us saying that, that is global peers saying that. And our sports and exercise science program, whose roots lie in a very windy, windswept physical education program at an empty Warren Ponds campus, is now ranked #1 in the world and has been for 3 of the last 5 years. Sport is particularly special to Australians. As someone who grew up in the UK, we would comment often, it wouldn't matter what it was, tiddlywinks, hopscotch. If you could play it, the Australians would compete and compete hard and compete to win. And it is a unique part of this country's amazing contribution to the global stage. I've got a line in here about our AFL partnerships, but I think we'll move on from that tonight because it's probably not a night for Geelong, it's a night for Richmond. For us, universities are social institutions, but so are football clubs. They have a vital role in bringing us together, making us feel special about the world we occupy, making us network of friends and colleagues, and bringing together amazing understanding. And that's something that I really appreciated coming here, having grown up in the UK where perhaps competitive football didn't quite do the same for strong bonds between communities. To come here, 105,000 people at the MCG, stream out together and be part of something bigger than the game is extraordinarily special, and something that Melbourne and Australia should be incredibly proud of. And tonight's guest speakers, Peggy O'Neill and Brendan Gale, have been part of that extraordinary experience for our state. In her tenure as president of the Richmond Football Club from 2013 to 2022, an almost 4-decade-long premiership drought was broken, is obviously amongst one of Peggy's fondest memories. But she talks of valuing the good and the not so good times equally, saying those experiences allow her to witness a cultural change and to see good people identify their common purpose and achieve a common goal. We're thrilled to have also with us Brendan Gale, the football club's Chief Executive Officer, together with a conversation, together leading our conversation. Tonight promises to be an incredibly rich and exciting evening. We're all looking forward to hearing it. But I do want to finish with some comments about David. Tonight honours David's incredible contributions to leadership, to knowledge, to practice, and perhaps for the university to education most especially. We awarded him an honorary doctorate in 2013 as partly saying thanks for that incredible contribution. His 30 years experience needs little further mention to say how significant it's been. But one of the things I have learnt in my 5 years in Victoria, where I came to AFL not having sat and watched a game until Collingwood Geelong in 2019, is that like every sport, it has its own language and its own euphemisms. And apparently David was described as a very rugged and determined back pocket. Now, that absolutely is a euphemism for someone who perhaps pushes the boundaries to beyond what is acceptable and might be acceptable now. But those euphemisms in sport, I think, are part of what makes it so very special. So tonight, it gives me very great pleasure to be in your company, and I really look forward to tonight's wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Let's bring our stage party together. It is my pleasure to welcome tonight's moderator, a true icon of Australian sports journalism, Tim Lane. A proud Tasmanian, Tim's illustrious career spans over 5 decades. Renowned for his insightful commentary across a spectrum of sports, including cricket, tennis, athletics, and of course Australian rules football, Tim has rightfully earned his place as one of the most respected voices in the industry. From his early days as a radio commentator to becoming a familiar face on the ABC TV, Tim's contributions have earned him prestigious accolades, including induction into the Melbourne Cricket Club Media Hall of Fame and Tasmania Football Hall of Fame. One of Australia's preeminent sports journalists, please join me in welcoming to the stage Tim Lane. Introducing Peggy O'Neill could take a long time, so I'm going to give you a very snapshot picture. Peggy O'Neill AO was the first woman in AFL history to serve as the club president, serving in that role at the Richmond Football Club from 2013 to 2022, a role that will be the spotlight in tonight's oration. Peggy also serves on the AFL's Mental Health Steering Committee and Australian Institute of Sport Athlete Wellbeing and Engagement Advisory Committee. In 2018, she was appointed to the AFL's Competition Committee. Outside of her involvement in sport, Peggy is the current Chancellor of RMIT, a Fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and a member of the Chief Executive of Women and Melbourne Forum. In the not-for-profit sector, she is on the board of Women's Housing Limited and Dementia Australia Network, and is also on the Investment Advisory Panel for Home for Homes, an initiative of the Big Issue. She is also a member of the board of the Fulbright Australian Commission. In 2019, Peggy was made an Officer of the Order of Australia for her services to Australian rules football, financial services law and women's leadership. And in 2021, she was named Melburnian of the Year. Joining Peggy tonight will be Richmond Football Club CEO Brendan Gale. Brendan Gale played 244 games at centre-half forward in the ruck for Richmond between 1990 and 2001. After his playing career, Brendan practiced law with a commercial law firm, King Wood Mallesons. I think he reflects on the dizzy heights of his legal career around the same watermark as his rock and roll career as guitarist in the seemingly undiscovered band Trial by Video. Brendan served as CEO on the AFL Players Association from 2005 to 2009 and has been a member of the AFL's Laws or Rules of Games Laws of the Game and Rules Committee. On the 10th of August in 2009, he was appointed CEO of the Richmond Football Club. In 2010, Brendan went public with his predictions for the Richmond Football Club. In a bold and brave statement, he declared that the next 10 years would see the Tigers win 3 premierships and achieve 75,000 members. Skeptics were vocal, and many were at lengths to point out that the Tigers hadn't won a premiership for over 30 years and had around 36,000 members at the time. Even the true believers had to acknowledge that Brendan had set a lofty bar for himself and any unsuspecting incoming president. Under their outstanding collective leadership, Peggy and Brendan oversaw the regime that saw the Richmond Football Club win 3 premierships in 2017, 19 and 20, and in 2018 became the first AFL club to reach 100,000 members. Please welcome to the stage Richmond Football Club royalty, Peggy O'Neill and Brendan Gale.
Thank you, mate.
Just before Brendan and Peggy, a quick word about David. The title of our discussion is From Good to Great, and nothing could be more appropriate for a David Parkin oration. I say that with authority because as a Carlton supporter, I saw him take 2 different Carlton teams in different decades from good to great. Firstly, a talented one to which he brought some steel, and they won back-to-back premierships in his first 2 years, actually knocking off Richmond in a very fierce match in 1982. And then I watched him again when John Elliott, having sacked him in the mid-80s, called him back in an hour of need for the Blues, and David lifted a team which had been in awful trouble and was mired in the bottom half of the ladder to a premiership within 5 years. And the thing that I've always remembered about that is that as I watched that team improving, I saw it doing similar things which David had brought to Carlton in the early years of the 1980s. And it made me realise that when you see the work of a good coach, you can actually see what he's about, and thus it was with David. And of course, it wasn't all done on the park. He was relentless. Stories are famous about his preparation and his reviews, which often caused him to sleep on the floor of his office at Princes Park, having worked well into the night. He was a relentless and obsessive man. So David, we hope we can appropriately honour you for your mentorship in various realms with tonight's discussion. Just start with Brendan, because you were at Punt Road before Peggy actually realised that she might get to like Australian rules football and become a football person. You arrived as a teenager from Tassie in '87. From 1990, your 12 years as a senior player began, and in only 2 of those seasons did the Tigers play in the finals. Perhaps seminal to what followed years later was that you played under 6 senior coaches in those 12 years, and only John Northey of the 6 lasted 3 seasons. Did the turnover of coaches in that part of your football life influence you and cause you to realise how important stability would be in the development of a highly successful team?
Certainly not at the early stages, Tim. I was a young kid who'd just come to Melbourne with so much to learn, and it was like drinking from a fire hose. You just did what you're told. You're trying to improve yourself as a player and make a contribution. I had a few injuries early on as well, so I think we had Kevin Bartlett. Kevin was very, very positive and optimistic and gave us a lot of young kids an opportunity. So probably not early, but I think as I established myself as a player and we started to grow collectively as a team and become competitive and make finals, and it was John Northey, we really began to improve in '94 and '95. I really felt at that stage we had the right group of people, the right age profile, the talent, the commitment to sort of go on. And then through an inexplicable reason at the time, John left. And So, you know, why left is debatable, but the fact is he left. He obviously was in an environment where he felt he had to leave. And I reckon that set the group back a little bit. That really, I wouldn't say it angered me, but it really frustrated me that when I felt we're about to continue to grow and evolve, there was change again. And Robert Walls came in, and I love Robert Walls. He's such an admirable guy. But it just didn't quite work. And then Robert left, and Jeff Geeschen, and so on and so forth. So certainly that period under John and the circumstances of his departure left an impression upon me, which I think maybe I drew on a little later.
Well, a decade and a half later, you became the club's CEO, and not long after you settled into the CEO's office, you had to oversee the appointment of a new coach, and it's such an important appointment, and Richmond hadn't been very good at it. It seemed in those years that the business of appointing a coach at a lot of football clubs was about as scientific as a game of pin the tail on the donkey. So how did you go about ensuring that Richmond at that point in their history got it right?
Well, I was appointed in late August, and they were probably halfway through that process. Peggy was on the board at the time. There was a appointment subcommittee with some subject matter experts, etc.
And I was on the committee that hired Brendan. Yeah.
So, but I wasn't to start for a few months. But I wanted to be involved in the final stages of that appointment process. I think it was down to the last 4. I just felt it was important for me to be invested in that outcome. But the process that was put in place was a very robust one. Craig Cameron was the head of football. You know, Gary March as president had a good aptitude around football as well, and I think they were committed to going through a rigorous process and ultimately appointing a coach that could address the immediate needs of the team, but grow and evolve as the game grew and evolved. And that person was Damien Hardwick. And the good thing was the strong process led to really strong consensus around that candidate, which was Damien. And so it was great to be involved. I'm glad I was, but the process had been sort of put together beforehand.
Peggy, must be nice when you're appointing a CEO to your organisation as a board member and the perfect one walks in the door, because Brendan was virtually born for a job like this and had trained himself for it. Was it that simple?
It wasn't quite that simple, but everybody recognised Brendan's leadership qualities, and I was following football when Brendan was playing toward the end there. And then when he started practicing law, even though somehow we'd catch over coffee every now and then. And
I would vent.
Yes, and he would say how boring law was. And I remember saying, "You're meant for something better than this, Brendan." And we often say, "Did you ever think you'd be CEO and I'd be president?" Because we never talked about it that way. I wasn't on the board or anything like that. So then I remember we were having lunch when you said you were going to the AFLPA and the time that he spent there. So he'd been there for a while, and I sort of knew Brendan. I didn't know him well, but when we were looking for a CEO, his name came up, and I knew Brendan was interested in leadership and his great affection for the club. So we talked to him about it, and he was interviewed as well. You know, it wasn't just walk in the door and it's yours. But I must say, looking back, that August 2009, when Brendan and Damien both came to the club, we seemed to get both of those appointments right.
Did you question his judgment when he released that blueprint for the future, which had a lot of people sort of staring in disbelief at the back page of their papers the morning the story appeared? And it was remarkable. And rereading Michael Gleeson's news report from The Age of that day, where near the foot of the story he says that Gale didn't actually specify how many premierships Richmond would win in this period, I couldn't help wondering whether that was done with his tongue firmly planted in his cheek.
Well, the board was across Brendan's plans. He came in as the new CEO, and one of the things in any business is, what does the CEO want to accomplish? And having an aspirational target is a wonderful thing, but also it's got to be more than just aspiration. You have to start putting all the building blocks in place to at least move in that direction. And we had a lot of building to do to get there. But at the same time, it sort of kick-started everything and Brendan's strong leadership was, we can get behind this, we can see something good happening. Did I think that in 10 years we would have accomplished all those things? I didn't think that far ahead. At that point, I was on the board, but I wasn't president, and we were just thinking, how do we get out of debt and that financial footing? And that was the number one priority at the beginning, was if we got out of debt, then we could do some other things. So we have to start really working on that. We needed a new training facility. We had no training facility. We were having trouble getting insurance for things. We were in a pretty bad way. So there were some of the easy things to accomplish, not the retirement of debt, but once that happened, we were able to get Punt Road as our training ground. Brendan worked 2 years on getting cricket home so that we could have our own training ground, and that allowed us to have a VFL team, and then we got our women's team. And so a lot of things come from those small first steps and identifying what your priorities are. So like you say, sometimes you have to wait a while to achieve it, but I think Brendan's strong leadership, we were all behind him.
But as you'd appreciate, Tim, it's convenient for it to be this way, but there's no one person or one reason. And let's call it a new broom. There was a largely new executive team, and some had no involvement, well, most, in fact, had no involvement with Richmond at all prior, except for maybe one or two. But we had an existing board that really had done some heavy lifting and gave us a really strong mandate to make the right change. Not the reactive populist change, but the long-term change. And there were probably 2 or 3 areas we needed to fix before we could even hope that football got right. And so, and Peggy just touched on a few of those. So we were given the time and space to push ahead with those and begin to build that really strong platform.
It was an incredibly bold thing to do, though.
It was, but it wasn't. I just felt having some involvement with the club as a player, albeit a very confined one, it is a limited experience. You turn up and play and train and that's it. But I always felt that, we weren't always on the same page. There seemed to be a lack of trust between administration and players and board, and there'd been sort of reactive type decisions, football quick fix type decisions. It often looked like a sack coach, let's just get a new coach and relieve the pressure. I just felt that, we just felt that, I've lost my train of thought, sorry. It wasn't based on hype. There was some real rationale and logic behind it. And that, like 75,000 members, where we had a huge database of members that lapsed and had no relationship with the club. So if we could reach out to those and build some trust and give them a reason to get back involved and believe, well, they could come back on. We could get to 75. Look, very simply, historically, Richmond has been a great club. It's proved that it can win premierships and compete at the highest level. A long period of dormancy, but we can go there again, and so on and so forth. So it wasn't without rationale and logic, I guess.
So a new broom, and it was actually wielded by a fortune teller, which is a little unusual, but my word, it was well done. And Peggy, you mentioned the debt that you were facing at that stage. Brendan also had all the answers to that, because when he first arrived in Melbourne, the club landed itself financial trouble, and he was one of the tin rattlers, I gather, out on Brunton Avenue and Warrnambool back in the day, at the end of the 80s.
Well, that's probably the other real event that left a real impression upon me. That is I'll tell you a very quick story. I spoke with Arthur Wilson the night before the 2007 draft, who is the revered Fitzroy recruiting manager. And I was planning to join Fitzroy at pick 3. Richmond got in first, and unbeknownst to me, I hadn't even been contacted. My father rang me the next day and said, guess what, you've been drafted. I mean, there was no radio, there's no TV, and I said, right, where to? Richmond. I said, gee, Richmond, are you serious? He said, Richmond. He said to me, look, don't ever tell your brother, don't ever tell your brother, but, you know, Fitzroy is always going to be at the margins, you know, questions over their future. Richmond's a great club, and if you're any good, and that's a big if, you know, you're a chance to play in the MCG, etc., etc. So I get drafted to Richmond, I go there, within 2 years we're begging for money, we're technically insolvent. And I guess I saw the impact that on, you know, that hand-to-mouth poverty almost, I saw the impact that had on the psyche of administrations and coaches and players. And so, you know, to me, you know, financial strength and power and the ability to determine your own future and invest in the priorities you determine were critical and remain so today.
And we should give your father a nod too, because Don Gale was an All-Australian representing Tasmania at the 1958 Carnival, which was just about, until recently, Tasmania's finest ever achievement in its proud football history. That was the centenary year of the Australian game, and a carnival was played here in Melbourne with the big states, and Tassie knocked off both Western Australia and South Australia. And it wasn't as though they weren't trying. I mean, at these events, everyone wanted to put their best foot forward. WA beat Victoria 3 years later at the Carnival in Brisbane. Don was All-Australian that year at that Carnival. Peggy, just in fairly potted form, perhaps your ascension from immigrant from the United States who happened to settle in Richmond to becoming the president of the club over the course of about 14 years?
Oh, I don't know how many years, but I do remember the Save Our Skins campaign. I just moved to Richmond, and I love sport. I grew up in these tiny towns in the Appalachian Mountains in America, and sport was always the social hub. Like most small towns, there's not a lot to do, but that's something that girls didn't get to play, but we got to watch, and I went to everything. So when I moved here, and everybody was talking about Australian rules football, and the MCG I can see almost from my house, I thought, well, everybody seems to have a team, so I'll pick the team that has my suburb's name. And I think a lot of migrants probably do the same thing. And I said, and they're not going very well. They're out there trying to raise money. So maybe I should become a member and get behind this community sport. And a number of colleagues at work said, oh, you should have been here in the 70s. They used to be good. And I said, oh, I didn't know what that meant. But I said, oh, we'll be good again. You know, you got to get in. As I didn't realize it'd be, 30 more years. So I became a member, and I started going to the game, and I just loved it. I loved the whole spectacle. I'd never seen the ground so big. No offsides. Besides American gridiron, it's so, precise and stop-start and all. Anyway, I just loved it. So I found myself sort of putting as a priority on my calendar every week, go to the football. Wherever Richmond's playing, I'm going to go. And then I thought, it'd be fun to see what the stadiums look like in other states. So I started going to the away matches. And in 2005, I was asked if I would be interested in joining the board. And I thought, they're always in, something's always happening down there. And they don't have any money. And they seem to fight all the time. And I thought, well, they're not going to ask again. And I would be the first woman. And you think, if I'm no good at it, I'll know right away. They'll tell me, and I'll get, they'll tell me to leave. And then I'll just go back to going to the football, because it's the love of the game that really sort of drove me. And I remember saying when I went on the board, as long as I don't have to go every week to those president's functions, because I don't like those, I want to sit in the crowd, I want to watch the game. So I was on the board for 8 years and served in a number of committees, and sort of my part with my legal background, I thought one thing is governance has never been very big. Whenever you say governance, everybody glazes over anyway. But I thought there's some basic principles. If you get these hygiene things right, like how do you find board members, who on the board looks across all the finances, who is looking at how we HR, remuneration, uses those basic things that you see in lots of businesses. And I thought if we just put that in, then we can have somebody helping management, because these are small organizations. And so I sort of think that was my contribution. And there were a couple of other people on the board who thought the same way. All of us were from professional services firms, so that might tell you something. Nobody else was interested, but we were. And so then I was on the board for 8 years, and Gary March, who had done a great job at getting us to that point, he'd served for 9 years, and he said he didn't want to have another term. We didn't have term limits then. And so he encouraged me to stay with it and think about going for it. And I said, oh, nobody will ever want a woman as president. But it was all men and me on the board, and the board elects the president, and they elected me. And that was 2013. And so it wasn't quite that linear, but it was just years of being a fan and thinking, well, this is something that I can do. And after having encouraged, women when opportunities come up to, have a go, I thought, no matter how much I don't want to be in the media or have people looking at everything you do, I need to go on and step up and do this.
Brendan, you'd been CEO for 3 years or so by that stage. Just looking back on it now, to what extent was the symbolism, but also the reality of an American woman with a North American accent becoming president of the club, the first female to be an AFL club president? How much did that drive the renewal of the Richmond Football Club and the making of modern Richmond?
Yeah. Early on, I probably didn't appreciate the significance of it because it was just Peggy, and Peggy's contributions at the board level were outstanding, and I think that was a shared understanding, and so it wasn't surprising that she was given that opportunity by the board. And I think, as Peggy often credits as well, it says a bit about the board at the time as well. They're willing to do that. But it wasn't until after they really saw the opportunity to present, I guess, our club in a slightly different way. I guess the symbolic aspect, which was secondary but still important. We were really trying to present ourselves in a different way as a footy club. The composition of Australia is changing rapidly from a multicultural point of view, and there probably wasn't that sense of involvement in our game, let alone women, which comprise obviously 50% of our population. So, and this is before, AFLW wasn't even on the drawing board at this stage. So I think it's the old saying, you can't be what you can't see. So I think having Peggy at the helm allowed members and supporters and potential employees and stakeholders to see a role, a future, a connection with a club that may not have been there previously. But first and foremost, Peggy was an expert at corporate governance, and so it was no surprise.
But in so many ways, you could not have been greater opposites, in that you were born to be a footballer and to perhaps have a life in football, and Peggy was born in a place where there was not even any knowledge of the game, and only came to it much later. Was that something that mattered, or was it a strength?
It mattered to me at the beginning that I was so outside. I didn't understand I understood the interest in me as being the first woman, but I didn't understand the continual watching what I did, and I thought, well, why don't people just ask me rather than assume things? But over time, I came to think being an outsider was a real advantage over time, because there were no sacred cows as far as I was concerned. I didn't know who anyone was, and it gives you a sort of freedom that you can just work through and make decisions based on information, not because you're friends with people, not that colors everything. But I thought my job is to be president of the Richmond Football Club, and they've entrusted me with this for however long the board wants me to continue. And it's not to be friends with everyone. It's not to have a profile of my own, which is sort of started happening because I was the first woman, and then we started winning. So you sort of, you get ascribed a lot of magical properties just because you happen to be there when the team's winning. But over time, I've come to think, that sort of just finding your own way. And Brendan was a great help. He introduced me to so many people. I'd say, who's that? Who's that one? But I think in the end, my job wasn't to worry about those things. You want to be friendly, and you want people to respect you. But the fact that I didn't have brothers who played, or I didn't have friends who had married footballers who knew all that, that sort of, there's great dynasties all over Australia with football families, and I didn't know any of that. So while I loved football and I loved the history of it, I kept saying, but my job is to be president of Richmond.
And I think we probably have some similarities as well in some respect, like, well, maybe not in similarities, but things I really respect and that I think are non-negotiable in this crazy world of fully administration. And I think we share, I think moderation, composure, humility, I really relate to those things in Peggy and respect and admire them. And it just so happens, I just think they're an absolutely non-negotiable quality in football administration. And so, she's interesting and interested in things outside of footy, and can be a bubble. So the opportunity to get your head out of footy, talk about different things from time to time, I think is really important too.
Damien Hardwick, by this stage, was about 4 years in the job, and then Richmond got on a mini roll and played finals for 3 consecutive years, but didn't win one, and found novel ways to lose them, and ways which were in keeping with its sort of Keystone Cops style in those days. Carlton knocked you out one year without actually making the 8, which was unprecedented, and then Trent Cotchin kicked against the wind in the first quarter at the Adelaide Oval, and so on and so forth. And I can imagine the pressure would have been growing when, after into the 7th year, with expectation starting to rise because of those finals appearances, something went wrong and you had a terrible year, but you persevered with your coach before the success floodgates opened. What was the reality of that period through 2016 when you had that bad year?
Well, I'll talk about it from the board's perspective, and then Brendan can add in, but Brendan and I talked a lot that year. But we recognized 2013, I wasn't president. I came in after that season was finished in October of 2013. And then 14, we had to win 9 games in a row to get into finals. Then we lost the first one. 2015, we had a better season, but North Melbourne beat us in the first game. And we had talked about there's something that we can't quite get from good to great. We're competitive, but we can't say that's enough. We want to win. And so even before 2016, we had talked to Brendan because Damien was up for renewal of his contract or extension of his contract, to sort of analyze where Damien was in his career compared to successful coaches at that time, and to come back to the board. And so we took our time. We took about 4 months over Christmas and into February, March, about whether to extend his contract, and if so, how long. And Brendan came back, and one of the things Brendan did that was very valuable when you ask how often coaches turned over is Brendan prepared a graph of how many times Richmond had changed coaches, and we never got any better. We never got better. It doesn't mean you just stick with your coach, but you don't automatically assume if we just could get someone new. And I remember thinking when I came into the football world is, if you keep having a turnover, don't you start over every time? It's not like you have a continuum and at some point you just think this is a bad period and we'll figure out how to get better. So Brendan came back with the recommendation about extending Damien for a couple of years. The board sat on it for couple of board meetings because, again, we weren't in that big a hurry, but we wanted to go on and give Damien some indication. And we also talked about, well, what if we go backwards? Because we did, and we said, we're just going to stick it out. We're going to go with 2 years, and we'll just stick that out. And sure enough, by probably April of 2016, it was clear that we weren't going to be very good. And so Brendan had already started a process, again, that the board asked him to do in evaluating what we needed to do to get better and what were those things, because often it is just changing the coach. And we thought if we think we got the right coach, it's got to be some other things. And Brendan found someone who consulted in this around the world on what are the things that make successful teams of any kind, and came back to us with some recommendations and sort of confirmed things that we had been thinking about. And now we had some data to sort of make some of those decisions. And by then, sort of all hell was breaking loose. And I remember saying to someone on the radio, I was being interviewed, just because you don't see something happening doesn't mean something's not happening. And so you want to take it up from there, that came back to the board?
It was a fascinating year. I can say that now, Tim, looking back upon reflection, but often describe the year as being like Monty Python's Holy Grail, because what Peggy, there was a smell of a great Richmond implosion, like the Sun, the papers, there was blood in the water, and there was just a blowtorch week in, week out. There's 2 or 3, board coups being plotted. There was the, People's Front of Judea, the G and People's Front, and so it was just, that was comical. And but I think what I learned that year was the value and the strength of a really strong and united board that was able to answer the questions, I guess, that have been put to Richmond so many times that we probably hadn't answered. And so, we're given and under Peggy's leadership, I guess I was given the opportunity to go back and get under the hood and get a really better understanding of what's working and what isn't. And basically, a lot was going right. And we weren't winning finals, but getting in finals was a measure of success. All the other aspects of the business were really, really strong. We felt Damien had the capable to be a really good coach. No guarantees, of course. We felt the coaching is a program. There's so many aspects of elite performance that we needed to change and evolve and live. And so basically we didn't make reactive populist decisions. We didn't sack a coach and relieve the pressure of the board. We absorbed the pressure and we made the changes based on evidence and facts. And away we went. Now, not for one moment did I think that we would win in 17, I'll be honest, but I felt very, very strong through that process. And when we went through that exercise together, all of us, there was almost a sense of fearlessness. And it was a real golden thread that went through the entire organisation. And I remember the French existential philosopher, Albert Camus. Is that how you pronounce it?
That's it.
Yeah.
I remember reading a magazine stuffed in the back of a plane, and I was reading an article, and there's a quote attributed to him. It said, in the depth of winter, I learnt within myself an invincible summer. And I remember reading that at the time, and I just said, that's where we're at. We're through this. And there you go.
Very disappointed. On the back of a magazine on an aeroplane, I read that in Conrad Marshall's book, and I thought you'd been getting into Camus.
No, but I think it's also worthwhile mentioning at that time that Brendan hinted at, but the unity on the board, the fact that we had all taken our time to make the decision, nobody could resile from, you picked the coach, you made it, and in fact the board said to me and Brendan, you do what you think is right. And that is a really powerful thing when you're being sort of chipped that away all around, to think that the people here whose opinions matter, who have the same information you have, say, do what you think is right. And so we did. But one of the things also that happened at the end of 2016 is we strongly suggested that Damien go to Harvard to take a subject over there called authentic leadership. And a number of coaches have taken it. But at that time, it really resonated with him, and he changed. He really came back a different person and sort of found, it's called True North. It's been going on at Harvard for a couple of decades. And it helps leaders find out when they operate at their best. And I think Damien started to realize it's the relationships that matter. It's not counting, all the data and the analysis is important. But what we also found during this review that Brendan did was that the players were just aching for some more contact with the leader. And so that was about getting more support around Damien, him coming back and saying, and then 2017, you told me early on in the preseason 2017, it feels different. They're having fun because before people were just dying to get out of the place. So that really made a difference. And I thought often coaches work on professional development, they don't work on personal development. And then after a while, now you hear a lot of coaches talk about the personal development and what they're going to do and having those relationships with their players. But Damien really, I think, was the first one who started talking about it in that kind of way.
Damien, you'd be surprised to know, is an empiricist. He's a trained accountant. And for a guy who's a lunatic on the field, he's very nuts, he's XY, he's very data-driven. Almost too much. In fact, he defaulted too much to data and just was spinning the wheels. And when this was presented to him, this week in Cambridge, in Boston, at your Harvard, all expenses paid, it was like, no, I don't want to go. I said, what do you mean you don't want to go? He said, no, I can't. I've got to go to, look at a gym in Holland, something like that, some rubbish. I said, mate, you've got to go. You're actually going. Because for you, it's not about that. It's about self-discovery and self-mastery. And if you don't go and you don't get that right, you're stuffed. In fact, we both are.
I said to Brendan, don't ask him to go. The board's telling him
you're going.
To go.
And he came back, and funnily enough, he was on that course with Ross Lyon. Yes, and so for Damien, it really was catalytic. And that's the great story here. I mean, Peggy and I can bang on. But for him, the public leader of the club, under incredible pressure, would be entitled to probably, bunker down and be defensive and negative and just shut out. He opened up. He completely went the other way. And he took the players with him. And it was an incredible metamorphosis under great pressure.
There was also the development of the game style, which proved so powerfully effective over those golden years. So where did that come from? Was that the coach working with the players, and between them they developed this vision of how they could play the game and what would work?
You want to take this one?
Well, a little bit, because Damien would talk about he had to work with the players he had. There had been compromised drafts. We were always there in the middle. We didn't have a lot of number one draft picks, that sort of thing. So he developed a game style. He had a lot of good runners, and he had a lot of little people, and he had Jack Riewoldt. And so the game style was a bit of, and they had Alex Rance down back and Trent in the middle. So that was sort of the spine. But by and large, he just had to work with what he had. I mean, we had Sean Grigg playing ruck, and he's now coaching up at the Gold Coast with Damien. But that was sort of the way my interpretation was. He made the most of what he had. And I remember one of the players saying to me, I don't have to do everything, I just have to do my part. I finally realized that, and I'm just expected to do this. And that seemed to make a difference.
We won't have time to spend too long on the premiership years, so I should apologise to Richmond fans who are here and who would love to indulge in that. But when did you first look at each other and say, hey, we can win this?
I said it a lot sooner than Brendan. He said, you're tempting the gods, don't say that. Gods. I was the beginning of the third quarter, and I said, we're going to win this. I just couldn't imagine by then that we would lose.
There was a period, Peggy's, there is a concept known as the footy gods. You don't tempt the footy gods, and Peggy's an agnostic when it comes to the footy gods. He's just maybe an atheist. But there was a period, you might recall, early in 17, when we changed our game plan 180 degrees, as Peggy said, and we started 5-zip. And then we lost those 3 games in almost inexplicably remarkable circumstances after the siren, etc. So we had 3 in a row, and it was just like, we're being tortured. And I remember the third one in a row we lost against the Giants in Homebush when a goal that Shea Bolton kicked in the dying seconds, which would have, was denied and called back, and they kicked in, scored, and we lost in the last 5 seconds. And it was just, I'll never forget. But I remember going down to the rooms, you've got to pull yourself together, and the way he spoke, I just expected almost the baseball bat to come out. In fact, I almost wanted it, just for my own catharsis, really. But he never changed, and he just spoke openly and consistently. And I remember Barmy walked out and just said, that was pretty damn impressive. We won the next week, and I thought it was a real test. And then we just got in a bit of roll. And when we played Adelaide in the grand final, in the last 8 games, I think if you took the last 8 games, I think we're 6 points clear on top, and a significant percent. We were flying. Adelaide were quite rightly favourites that day, but we were in red hot form. I thought we'd be hard to beat. But even at 45 points over 3/4 time, I wasn't calling it.
Yes. I should mention that you said you thought it wouldn't be a bad thing if the baseball bat came out. It has been said to me that you have shown a remarkable ability to not involve yourself. As a man who played, 240-odd senior games and then became the club CEO, you have managed to stay away from any involvement in the football side of the game. Is that a...
No, not entirely. Not entirely. Look,
But compared to St Kilda recently, and it actually prompted a change of CEO.
I don't know. I don't have visibility. But look, I've got... I'm very confident in my knowledge of football and of performance and what it requires, and bad, good. But I just felt early on in my tenure as CEO, I think we needed to put attention elsewhere. And the first was about the organisation alignment from board down, the culture, the purpose, the vision, the plans, the trust. The second part were the commercial aspects. It was about making money when money really mattered, and we were hand to mouth for so many years. We needed to provide a really strong platform for football. I guess I've had faith in the people I've had in football. I know what I need to know. I know when things are a little bit sort of out or off. I think I know where there's a bit of bullshit as well. Not there's been too much of that. I know when to involve myself. But by and large, I trust the judgment and the decision making of the people who are there to run it and have courage of it. And if you get involved too much and you start questioning their judgment too much, well, then you've got to ask you got the right people. I don't have blind faith, but I've got a deep faith and trust in our people.
We're getting towards the end of time, so we'll have to be reasonably brief. But I did want to talk about the other side of the modern Richmond Football Club. I suppose clubs start to express themselves a bit more freely when they're having some success, and it became apparent that Richmond was becoming a social leader among football clubs. There were issues during COVID on the Gold Coast. Was that uncomfortable, given that aspect of the club had now been expressed and there were failings during this time that was difficult for all of us and times that required discipline from all of us?
Yeah, I wasn't in the hub, but Brendan was, and we talked probably twice a day during that period. I guess we understood the pressure everyone was under and also the additional rules that the AFL had, but how fortunate we were as a club to still be playing. But I guess it's always regrettable when somebody acts in a way that doesn't really reflect your values as a club. But we've had people do that in the past, not in 2020, but in other situations. And people that we've given a second chance to have never let us down. So there's a bit of things happen, and let's just see what happens next, and also as a club, what do we do next? How do we going to react to this? And I don't think anger is ever the way. We had a number of board meetings along the way just to talk to Brendan and see what was going on. But he was there on the ground, and the whole 117 days with the whole team. I can imagine what that would be like to be with your workmates 117 days in a hotel. But he was closest to it, and because Brendan by then had been leader of the club for quite a while as CEO, as we trusted him to filter things through, and when he needed board involvement to come back, because Brendan's also a director on the board as well.
Conrad Marshall, in his book, referred to Richmond as the diversified sporting club in 2017, and it was a piece about Simon Matthews, your communications chief, needs to tell the story of Aligned Leisure, your fitness and recreation business, along with the Sports Institute, Leadership Institute through Swinburne, the Goran Gamaji Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Youth Leadership, your Next Generation Academy, your connection to the Alana and Madeline Foundation, the Bashar Houli Academy, and a partnership with Vic Health on gender equality. Has that sort of range of attachments become the norm, or was Richmond breaking new ground?
Oh, I guess we formalised. I mean, I think by and large, football clubs have always understood there's an obligation or vest back in the community that supports them. I mean, that's always been the case for 100 years or so. But no, I think early on, when we were building as a footy club, we probably didn't have a lot of love for members and corporate Australia. We didn't have a great story to tell. I felt there was a shift towards sort of purpose marketing. I mean, organisations gone with the days where they just want to stick badges on jumpers and create awareness. They wanted to walk a different journey and build capacity in communities and improve. And given football clubs are significant community organisations, and so we've got an Indigenous set of programs at the club that are about building leadership capacity of young Indigenous boys and girls students. That's a good thing to do. We think that's great for the nation, it's nation building, but it's also good for us, Tim, because we now, I think, have got a good supportive environment for Indigenous athletes, men and women, to come in and thrive. And so, and I think, that's just one example. You mentioned a few, but I think increasingly, members and fans and consumers of your footy club, they're increasingly buying into not so much what you do, it's the underlying reason of why you do it. What we do is play footy and we compete hard and fierce and we try and win. And we try and win finals and so on. But why we do it is slightly different. And I think, just speaking to Chris earlier's preliminary comments, it is about belonging and it's about trust and it's about, community building. And so I think, our record membership numbers and our corporate partnerships increasingly buy into the why of why we exist. What we do is play footy. Why is slightly different. And, it's about getting the balance right as well.
I've always, I've said for many years, before we'd won anything, while you're waiting to win, you got to do something to make your members proud, that you're doing something for the community. And for at least the 17 years that I was on the board, and still continues, is when you look at the strategy for the club, community has always been a number one pillar, what we do for our community. And Brendan elevated that to a real executive role at the club and gave it a lot of prominence, along with membership and commercial and all that. But community was to be the center of what we did, because without our members, but again, if you're relying on winning premierships to get members, we could only dream. But along the way, if you're doing things to make them proud in other ways, and we do a survey, I think all clubs do every year, about whether they think that's the right thing to do. And overwhelming, like 90% plus, like the fact that we do those community programs.
I think we better wrap it up there. Peggy, you're enjoying watching the Tigers in your retirement from officialdom?
I am thinking it's pretty nice to just go to the ground. Don't have to give a speech, don't have to go to a president's dinner, don't have to host a president's dinner. And it was kind of unusual. This year I went up to the Gold Coast and Brendan and I sat and watched the game together for the first time since I left. So that was, and I remembered how tense he got, and so I left.
The only tears shed that day were for the opposite reason.
That's
Those
right.
when you were sitting next to each other at the 2017 Grand Final. Have you given Brendan any advice about his career planning beyond the next year or two?
No. He hasn't asked, and I don't offer advice.
Do you think a change would be a good thing at this point?
I don't. Well, that's up to Brendan. So no. Do I think? Oh, I think he's got a lot of work still to do at the Richmond Football Club. Our redevelopment isn't finished yet.
Well, he has done a wonderful job, as you did too. But Brendan, you sort of went a little way on 3AW on Sunday. I was listening to it as I was driving to the ground. It did sound as though you won't be at Punt Road for too much longer, whatever that means.
I think that's fair, Tim. I think that's. I mean, there's a lot of speculation in this media mad world, but I jump out of bed every day, and I'm as keen, as motivated, as driven as I was day one. I mean, there's so much to do at Punt Road. I mean, we sort of, it's a continuum of footy. It never really ends. Even good to great, I'm a bit uncomfortable with. You're just trying to stay in the fight, and competitive, and we've got a huge redevelopment that will transform Punt Road. A fair bit of work to do on that. But I don't want to outstay my welcome as well. And this is my 15th year. And I need to be mindful of that, and certainly the club does as well. So what that means, Tim, I don't know. Yeah.
It's been a pleasure to have this chat with you, and I'm sure that's reflected out in the audience. There, I think, will be a formal vote of thanks, but you might like to give a ripple of applause to our...
Tim, I was a little bit like you. I was sort of watching my clock a little bit, hoping it'd slow down a little bit. It's such a compelling story. It is so interesting. And I think for most of us who lived it from the outside and watched that played out through the court of public opinion, and Hardwick should be gone, and all the stuff that went on, and Brendan coming out and saying things that were at the time sort of seen as the stuff of La La Land and things like that, was incredibly brave and those sorts of things. But to actually get behind the scenes and listen to the logic, the sense, the humility, the leadership that went on, the vision that went on through that phase is absolutely amazing. And it sort of strikes me that it's the stuff that we don't hear enough. Our TVs are just saturated with pop sport journalism, and quickly get rid of that, get rid of him, do that, and all that, and to sort of listen to you to just take us through the processes, the thinking, the logic, and all those sorts of things. I think it's something that is a gift for us to actually think that, to actually see that sort of level of commitment and bravery and sort of collective energy that makes such a difference. And I think that at the end of the day, ultimately it's the on-field heroics that get remembered in regimes, and the success that will be reflected will be the premierships. But I think what we saw tonight was the inside of the formidable leadership and strategy that underpinned that success. I think we leave here tonight with a richer appreciation of the importance of culture and leadership and vision in narratives of triumph. I think we leave here tonight with a deeper respect of how highly effective off-field leadership and governance intersects with on-field performance. You mentioned Richmond of the old, the sort of the work to reset the cultural dial of the Richmond Football Club, which was steeped in a hubris of relentlessness, bloody-mindedness and impatience, is not for the faint-hearted. And it's just, while hindsight's a powerful source of affirmation now, and we can all look back and, yes, you did all the right things, but I think in the day, at the time, it really did, words like brave, visionary, resilient and committed just, come to mind. Brendan and Peggy, It's clear that your collective vision and unwavering support for each other and for your beloved Richmond Tigers propelled the club to an unprecedented success and set a new watermark for the competition. Together, you have exemplified what it means to lead with integrity, passion, humility and vision. Your collaborative efforts not only transformed the Richmond Football Club to the modern entity it is today, but have inspired others who dare to dream big. Please join me in extending a heartfelt thank you to Peggy O'Neill and Brendan Gale for sharing their story behind the outstanding achievements. And of course, tonight's discussion wouldn't have mattered much without Tim Lane's skillful moderation in guiding the conversation with such depth and clarity. We are honoured by your willingness to participate in tonight's oration. And on behalf of everyone present, I want to express our gratitude to you for availing us to your journalistic mastery and skill. It is patently clear while you occupy the mantle as a legend in Australian sports journalism. Thank you so much, Tim Lane. In parting, I'd like to reaffirm our profound gratitude to David Parkin, the patron of this annual event. David, our partnership over the last 11 orations is something that I hold as a privilege. Thank you for your enduring support and inspiration. I close by publicly acknowledging the Deakin Events team, and in particular I thank Celeste Welsh for her work in supporting me bring this together. Distinguished guests, one and all, on behalf of Deakin University, I thank you all for your attendance here this evening and for your ongoing support for this event. I hope that you can join us at next year's David Parkin Oration for Sport and Social Change.